So now we're going to have a look at creating a metal finish for our door handles here. This obviously could apply to several other types of metal finishes. We're also going to create a chrome-like finish as well as a slightly brushed aluminium type metal as well. To start with, first of all we have to find the material, click on it, and we can see in the object browser stainless steel has been selected. Let's open the material editor and let's first create a chrome material from scratch. Basically a chrome material would have a very dark color, maybe with a touch of saturation, maybe a bit of blue, but it's a very dark color. It would also have a specular value. We should, in the specular channel, use the metal algorithm. And a good setting for metal is actually very high. If we put that to about 500, it makes it very bright. And we're going to drop the width and move the fall off up. So we've got a very square fall off. Maybe even put a little bit of inner width in it. Maybe the width could be a little bit smaller there. It will need some sort of reflection, so we need to turn the reflection on. Set that to about 35%, say. If we were to hit render, the software would obviously have to render the interior there, the furniture, the transparency, the reflections of the glass and whatnot. If I left mouse click on the render button there, but instead of clicking on it, we click hold it, and it comes up with additional options. And the first option is render region. So we can just drag a little area across the area that we want to render, and then the renderer will just render that particular area of this scene. And you can see that this material is like polished chrome. It's very reflective. It's pretty shiny. It's got some very defined specular reflections as well as the reflections of its surrounding environment. To add a little bit more shine to this material, we could go to the material editor again. We could use the environment channel, and in this file we already have the environment map loaded, so we don't have to search through the browser. We can just go to texture, click on the arrow next to texture, go to bitmaps, and there are several different materials there, but we're going to select Reno Suburb, load it in, and maybe adjust it so it's not that shiny, so there's not that much environment in there. Might beef the specular up a little bit more there, and I might just render that region again. And you can see that this object is looking quite a bit more shiny. Maybe it looks a little bit dark at the moment, but it's just a matter of adding a little bit more environment and making sure that it's actually not in the shade, because we're under the overhang under this building at the moment. But it's a pretty convincing, nice looking chrome material. Okay, let's change this material to a brushed aluminium type finish. So first we'll start with turning off all the channels, and in the color channels, clicking on the texture, we're going to go to effects and pick Loomis. Loomis is Cinema 4D's metallic paint, almost like a car enamel type finish. By default it comes in red, but of course you can change that to any color you like. As always with the shaders, you just click on the little preview, and we have a few settings for this already set. The first one's a shader, and basically it's set to active, so it's working. The color's set to red. That's the default setting, so I'm going to set that to slightly bluey but quite light in color. is 3 different specular channels that you can work with. This is where I would turn this off and just use the internal ones. The first specular color is set to white. Intensity, size, contrast, glare and fall off. These are things you can always experiment with, and if you turn it off you can see the effect that it has, and you can see that first specular channel controls that very center bright dot in there, and you can see that the intensity there is set to 125%. It's completely white, it's burnt out. Size is 0.5%, which means it's very small, and obviously by adjusting the size it will change that. The default setting is quite good, so we're going to leave that. The glare controls the amount of shine that gives off, and I'm going to set that back to about 200. And the fall off is the edge between the sharpness of the super bright and the dark areas on the outside. 100% means that it has a very sharp edge. Specular 2, once again you can turn it on and off just to see the effect that it has. Once again, I certainly don't want a pinky. We're going to work in more of a blue type look. And number 3, specular 3, again I'm going to change that color. We definitely don't want it to be red, so I'm just going to add a bit of blue again, add a different hue, change the hue, and then once again you have the active or inactive switch, so you can see the sort of effect that you're having on the material. If you wanted the metal to be less brushed and more shiny, you would probably be reducing the size of it, so it becomes or appears more shiny. As you increase the size it looks more like brush metal, but if you set it to about 80, that would be pretty good. Contrast, once again, some of those settings are very subtle, but overall they come out looking very realistic. So basically I've just changed the colors there, and if I were to render that now, I'm just going to render that little region again. You'll see that this object looks very metallic indeed. By adjusting the specular channels and give them different colors, you could achieve slightly different effects and a slightly different appearance. We can make it look a bit warmer by changing it to an orangey yellow hue, or a bit cooler if you wanted to, you'd mix more blues into it. And we should be experimenting here with the size and the other values here to get the appearance that you want. And this shader actually renders quite quickly. It doesn't include any reflections, and the whole metallic look is just generated by using and playing around with all these specular channels. We could of course add some reflection to that, and this will make the object look a bit more natural in its environment. You can see it's reflecting onto itself, and it's reflecting a bit of the building around it. So you can mix the Loomis shader with other shaders, and there's no need to be adding any of the specular channel at all, because this is taken care of by the internal specular settings of this shader. I could also add a little bit of external environment mapping just to make it a bit more shiny if I wanted to. But if we're after a brushed metal finish, the environment is probably completely unnecessary, and perhaps just a touch of reflection. Again, it just really depends on what your view is going to be showing. If the view is as large as your building, then the reflections on the door handles or small elements like these are probably not going to be that important, and it will probably slow the rendering down, so it's not going to add much to the overall realistic look of your scene. But on internal renderings, these might be the elements like furniture legs and taps, etc., that have a lot of reflections, and they can add quite a bit to the image. It certainly adds some realism to the rendering. You see, if I zoom out here and actually have a look at it, you can see the door handle will sit well in its environment, and they look pretty realistic from a distance. So it's not going to need any reflections. You could use the Loomis, of course, on any other metallic surface, like the louvers or the aluminium frames. And it is quite a nice shader and renders fairly quickly.